The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as Maya Chen adjusted her flight suit for the 100th time, her hands trembling not from nerves but from barely contained fury. In 3 hours, she would climb into the cockpit of a T-6 Texan for what was supposed to be a routine solo navigation exercise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know was that this flight would become the most talked about mission in Riverside Flight Academy's 70-year history, transforming her from the Academy's most ridiculed cadet into a legend that would inspire generations of pilots to come. The events leading to this moment had been building for months, each day adding another layer of humiliation and doubt that threatened to crush her dreams of following in her father's footsteps. But sometimes, the greatest victories emerge from the deepest valleys of despair, and Maya was about to discover that the sky doesn't care about your background, your gender, or how many people doubt you. It only responds to skill, courage, and an unbreakable will to soar. Maya Chen had arrived at Riverside Flight Academy on a gray September morning, with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a dog-eared copy of her father's flight manual, and a determination that burned brighter than the Nevada sun. The Academy sprawled across 2,000 acres of desert landscape, its modern hangars and pristine runways a testament to military precision and unlimited funding. For most cadets, this was just another step in a predetermined path of privilege and connection. For Maya, it represented everything she had fought her entire life to achieve. Her dormitory room in Block C was spartanly furnished with regulation beds, desks, and lockers that smelled of fresh paint and industrial disinfectant. Her roommate, Lisa Park, had arrived hours earlier with enough luggage to stock a small clothing store and a confidence that came from growing up in a family where military service was expected rather than dreamed about. Lisa's father was a colonel, her brother a Navy pilot, and her acceptance to the Academy had been as natural as breathing. Maya's acceptance, on the other hand, had required perfect test scores, flawless recommendations, and a scholarship that barely covered her expenses. The differences between them became apparent within minutes of meeting. Lisa unpacked designer flight bags and custom equipment, while Maya carefully arranged her few possessions, each item representing a significant sacrifice from her family's limited resources. Her flight suit was regulation, but clearly not new, her boots polished to military standards, but showing signs of previous wear. These details would normally go unnoticed, but at an academy where image often mattered as much as ability, they marked her immediately as different. The first week of orientation revealed the Academy's unofficial hierarchy with crystalline clarity. Brad Mitchell commanded the social structure like a general commanding troops, his presence filling every room he entered with the casual authority of someone born to lead. His grandfather had been a 3-star general, his father a test pilot, and his own acceptance to the Academy had been celebrated in military circles before he'd even graduated high school. Tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no, Brad represented everything the Academy valued in its future officers. Around Brad orbited a carefully selected group of cadets whose backgrounds mirrored his own. Children of generals, senators, and defense contractors who spoke the language of privilege fluently and wore their connections like invisible badges of honor. They moved through the Academy with the easy assurance of people who knew their futures were already mapped out, their careers already launched before they'd earned their first wings. Maya's background told a different story entirely. She had grown up on a small farm outside Bakersfield, California, where her mother struggled to keep the family operation afloat after Maya's father died in a training accident when she was 12. The farm specialized in crop dusting services, and Maya had learned to fly in battered old aircraft that held together through determination and prayer rather than regular maintenance. By 16, she was piloting planes older than herself across the Central Valley, developing an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that came from necessity rather than formal instruction. Her path to the Academy had been anything but conventional. While other applicants attended elite preparatory schools and expensive summer flight camps, Maya had accumulated flight hours by working weekends and summers, gradually building the experience necessary to qualify for military consideration. Her test scores were perfect not because of expensive tutoring, but because she understood that excellence was her only currency in a world that didn't automatically open doors for people like her. The Academy's academic program was rigorous but not insurmountable for someone who had spent years studying aviation theory by lamplight after 14-hour workdays. Maya excelled in her classroom subjects, particularly aerodynamics and navigation, where her practical experience gave her insights that pure theory couldn't provide. She understood how aircraft behaved in real weather conditions because she had flown through dust storms and thermal turbulence that would ground more cautious pilots. Her knowledge was earned rather than inherited, practical rather than theoretical. Flight instruction, however, proved more challenging than academic work. Not because Maya lacked skill, her flying abilities were exceptional by any measure, but because the social dynamics of the academy extended into every aspect of training. Instructor assignments, aircraft preferences, and even constructive criticism were subtly influenced by the unofficial hierarchy that placed legacy cadets at the top and scholarship students like Maya at the bottom. Colonel James Peterson epitomized the Academy's old guard mentality. A career officer whose own advancement had stalled at middle management, Peterson compensated for his professional disappointments by wielding absolute authority over cadet training. He had been shaped by an era when military aviation was an exclusively male domain, and women in his cockpits represented unwelcome change rather than progress. His interactions with Maya were professionally correct but tinged with skepticism that bordered on hostility. During her first solo flight evaluation, Peterson accompanied Maya through pre-flight procedures with the demeanor of someone expecting failure. His questions were sharp and designed to expose weakness rather than assess competence. When Maya demonstrated flawless knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency procedures, Peterson's expression remained unchanged, as if her preparation was merely adequate rather than exceptional. The flight itself went perfectly. Textbook takeoffs, precise navigation, and a landing that barely registered on the aircraft's shock absorbers. But Peterson's debriefing focused on minor points that wouldn't have been mentioned for other cadets. The real challenges, however, came from her fellow cadets rather than instructors. Brad Mitchell had initially ignored Maya completely, dismissing her as irrelevant to his social circle and beneath his notice. But as her academic performance and flight skills became undeniable, his indifference transformed into something more pointed and deliberate. He began making casual comments about diversity admits and charity cases that were never directed at Maya specifically, but were clearly intended for her ears. The comments escalated gradually, carefully calibrated to remain just within the bounds of plausible deniability. Brad would reference family military traditions within Maya's hearing, discuss the importance of natural leadership in contexts that excluded her, and make jokes about farmers playing pilot that drew laughter from his circle of followers. Each comment was individually insignificant, but collectively created an atmosphere of exclusion and doubt that was designed to make Maya question her place at the academy. Lisa Park found herself caught between loyalty to her roommate and pressure to maintain her own social standing. She genuinely liked Maya and respected her determination, but the academy's social dynamics made open support risky for someone whose own future depended on maintaining good relationships with influential families. Lisa's support came in private moments, encouraging words after particularly difficult days, help with academy protocol that Maya hadn't grown up understanding, and occasional defiance of unspoken rules about associating with outsiders. The Academy's training program progressed through increasingly complex phases designed to winnow out cadets who lacked the skills or temperament for military aviation. Navigation exercises tested pilots' ability to find their way across vast distances using only instruments and visual references. Formation flying required precision and trust that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Combat maneuvering pushed aircraft and pilots to their limits while maintaining safety margins that prevented training accidents. Maya excelled at every phase of training, her performance consistently ranking in the top 5% of her class despite the additional pressures she faced. Her navigation was precise to the degree that instructors began using her flight plans as examples for other cadets. Her formation flying demonstrated spatial awareness and control that impressed even skeptical evaluators. Most remarkably, her aircraft handling showed an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulators. This excellence, rather than earning respect, seemed to intensify the hostility directed toward her. Brad Mitchell's comments became more pointed and public, often delivered in settings where other cadets would feel pressured to laugh or risk their own social standing. He began questioning Maya's achievements openly, suggesting that her success resulted from preferential treatment rather than genuine ability. The implication was clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Women, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, didn't belong in elite military aviation programs. The situation reached a tipping point during a mess hall confrontation that would be remembered long after Maya graduated. Brad had been holding court at his usual table, regaling his followers with stories about his family's military achievements and the natural superiority that came from generations of military breeding. Maya sat several tables away with Lisa and Tommy Rodriguez, one of the few cadets who had befriended her without regard for social consequences. Brad's voice carried across the dining hall as he launched into a familiar theme about the importance of maintaining standards and not diluting the Academy's excellence for the sake of political correctness. His words were carefully chosen to avoid direct accusation while making his target unmistakable. He spoke about the difference between real pilots who belonged in military aviation and pretenders who were only present because of misguided diversity initiatives. The dining hall fell silent as Maya stood and walked directly to Brad's table, her movement drawing every eye in the room. The confrontation that followed would be recounted in different versions by dozens of witnesses, but everyone agreed on the essential facts. Maya had addressed Brad directly, her voice calm but carrying clearly throughout the silent hall. She had challenged him to prove his superiority through performance rather than pedigree, suggesting that if he truly believed in maintaining standards, he should be willing to demonstrate those standards himself. Brad's response revealed the insecurity that lurked beneath his confident facade. Instead of accepting Maya's challenge with the grace expected of a future officer, he had responded with personal attacks that exposed his character in ways that couldn't be walked back or explained away. He had made comments about Maya's background, her family's financial situation, and her gender that violated both Academy regulations and basic human decency. The dining hall erupted in a chaos of voices as cadets chose sides or tried to distance themselves from the confrontation. Lisa Park found her courage in that moment, standing with Maya despite the social cost. Tommy Rodriguez and several other cadets followed suit, creating a visible division in the room that reflected deeper tensions about the Academy's future direction. Colonel Peterson, drawn by the commotion, arrived to find his carefully maintained order shattered and his star cadet exposed as someone whose character didn't match his credentials. The official investigation that followed was thorough but unsurprising in its conclusions. Brad received formal counseling and temporary restrictions that would barely impact his schedule. Maya received warnings about maintaining good order and discipline that placed equal blame on victim and aggressor. The incident's aftermath revealed the Academy's institutional biases more clearly than any policy manual. Brad's supporters rallied around him, framing his comments as regrettable but understandable responses to provocation. Maya's supporters found themselves marginalized and subtly pressured to distance themselves from her cause. The message was unmistakable. Challenging the established order carried consequences that extended far beyond individual confrontations. Maya's response to this injustice surprised everyone who thought they understood her character. Instead of filing formal complaints or seeking outside intervention, she withdrew into herself and focused entirely on performance. Her flying became even more precise, her academic work even more thorough, her military bearing even more professional. She seemed determined to prove through excellence what she couldn't achieve through argument. This strategy came at a personal cost that was visible to those who knew her well. Lisa watched her roommate transform from someone who had arrived with dreams and enthusiasm into someone who approached each day like a military campaign. Maya's laughter became rare, her conversations focused strictly on professional matters, and her free time devoted entirely to study and preparation. She was becoming the perfect cadet in every measurable way, while losing the joy that had originally driven her to pursue military aviation. The Academy's training program culminated in a series of solo missions designed to test every skill cadets had developed during their time at Riverside. These flights represented the transition from student to pilot, from theoretical knowledge to practical application. For most cadets, they were celebrations of achievement and stepping stones to advanced training. For Maya, they represented her final opportunity to prove that excellence spoke louder than prejudice. The solo navigation exercise assigned to Maya's class was particularly challenging, requiring pilots to navigate across 200 miles of mountainous terrain using only basic instruments and visual references. The route passed through areas where radio communication was limited, and emergency landing sites were scarce. Weather conditions were forecast to be marginal, with possible mountain obscuration and turbulence that would test both aircraft and pilot. Maya approached her mission preparation with the same methodical thoroughness she had applied to every aspect of academy training. She studied weather patterns, memorized topographical features, and planned alternate routes that would allow her to complete her mission safely regardless of changing conditions. Her flight plan was so detailed that instructors used it as an example for other cadets, though they credited the work to Cadet Chen without acknowledging the person behind the achievement. The night before her solo flight, Maya sat alone in her dormitory room, reviewing charts and checking equipment one final time. Lisa had gone to a social gathering that Maya had been pointedly not invited to, leaving her with the silence and solitude that had become her constant companions. Outside her window, the academy's runways were illuminated by rows of lights that stretched into the darkness, like pathways to distant stars. Maya thought about her father during these quiet moments, remembering the stories he had told about his own military training and the challenges he had faced as a young pilot. He had died before seeing her develop her own passion for aviation, but she carried his memory with her into every cockpit and drew strength from his example during moments of doubt. Tomorrow's flight would be more than just a training exercise. It would be a testament to the dreams they had shared and the legacy she was determined to continue. As she finally prepared for sleep, Maya had no way of knowing that her solo mission would encounter conditions far more dangerous than any training scenario, or that her response to those conditions would transform her from an academy outcast into a legend whose story would be told for generations. The mountain ridge emergency that awaited her would test every skill she had developed and every lesson she had learned, both as a pilot and as someone who had refused to be broken by prejudice and doubt. The stage was set for a confrontation between preparation and crisis, between individual courage and institutional bias, between a young woman's dreams and a system designed to exclude her. Maya Chen was about to discover that sometimes the greatest victories come not from proving others wrong, but from proving to yourself that you belong wherever your courage and skill can take you. Dawn broke across the Nevada desert with the kind of clarity that made pilots dream of perfect flying weather, but Maya Chen knew better than to trust first impressions. Years of crop dusting had taught her to read the subtle signs that meteorologists often missed. The way morning shadows fell differently when atmospheric pressure was shifting, how the wind carried scents that spoke of weather systems still hours away from official detection. As she performed her pre-flight inspection of the T-6 Texan assigned to her solo navigation exercise, something in the air whispered of changes coming that would transform a routine training mission into something far more significant. The aircraft gleamed under the hangar lights, its silver skin reflecting the organized chaos of a military flight line preparing for the day's operations. Maya ran her hands along the wing surfaces, with the reverence of someone who understood that her life would soon depend entirely on this machine's reliability. Every rivet, every control surface, every instrument deserved her complete attention. Other cadets might rush through pre-flight procedures with the casual confidence of those who had never experienced mechanical failure over hostile terrain, but Maya approached each inspection with the thoroughness of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by years of flying aircraft held together more by hope than engineering. The hangar buzzed with nervous energy as her classmates prepared for their own solo missions. These flights represented a crucial milestone in their academy training, the moment when they would prove they could navigate complex airspace independently and make critical decisions without instructor guidance. For most cadets, the exercise was challenging but manageable, a test of skills they had been developing for months under careful supervision. The routes were carefully planned to avoid areas of significant danger, weather conditions were forecast to remain within safe parameters, and emergency procedures were thoroughly rehearsed for any situation they might reasonably encounter. Brad Mitchell held court near his assigned aircraft, surrounded by his usual entourage of admirers who hung on his every word about family military traditions and the natural advantages that came from genetic superiority. His voice carried across the hangar floor with the kind of projection that demanded attention, regaling his audience with stories about his grandfather's legendary missions and his father's test pilot achievements. Each anecdote was carefully crafted to remind listeners that military excellence ran in his bloodline, that his success was inevitable rather than earned through effort and dedication. Maya tried to ignore the performance while completing her checklist, but Brad's voice seemed designed to penetrate her concentration. He spoke about the importance of maintaining academy standards and ensuring that only naturally gifted pilots advance to operational squadrons. His words carried undertones that everyone understood. Women and diversity admissions represented compromises that weakened military effectiveness and diminished the achievements of those who truly belonged in military aviation. The social dynamics that had defined Maya's academy experience continued to play out even during mission preparation. Cadets from influential families clustered together, sharing information and encouragement that reinforced their sense of belonging and entitlement. Scholarship students and those from non-military backgrounds formed smaller, less confident groups that operated on the periphery of academy social life. The invisible barriers that separated these communities were as rigid as any physical obstacle, determining everything from study group invitations to social gatherings, to the subtle ways instructors distributed their attention and encouragement. Lisa Park approached Maya's aircraft with the careful neutrality she had maintained since the dining hall confrontation. Their friendship had survived that incident, but it now operated under constraints that both women understood without discussion. Lisa's family connections required her to maintain plausible distance from Maya's controversial presence, while Maya's pride prevented her from seeking support that might compromise her roommate's standing. They communicated through glances and small gestures that conveyed understanding and sympathy without creating political complications for either of them. Tommy Rodriguez proved more willing to openly associate with Maya, despite the social costs. His own background as the son of immigrants had given him insight into the challenges faced by outsiders in elite institutions. Tommy understood that excellence wasn't always recognized or rewarded fairly, that sometimes the most capable people were overlooked because they didn't fit predetermined molds. His friendship with Maya was genuine rather than strategic, based on respect for her abilities rather than calculation about social advantage. Colonel Peterson emerged from the Flight Operations Center carrying the clipboard that contained final mission assignments and weather updates. His expression suggested the kind of professional satisfaction that came from orchestrating complex training operations that would test cadet abilities under realistic conditions. Peterson represented the Academy's institutional memory, having overseen thousands of training flights during his tenure as chief flight instructor. His evaluations could determine career trajectories, and his recommendations carried weight that extended far beyond Riverside Flight Academy. The colonel's announcement of flight assignments created the usual mixture of anticipation and anxiety among the waiting cadets. Some routes were considered more challenging than others, requiring navigation through complex airspace or over terrain that offered limited emergency landing options. The most difficult missions were typically assigned to cadets whose abilities had been proven through consistent excellence, while easier routes went to those who needed confidence building rather than additional challenges. Maya's assignment came as a surprise to everyone familiar with Academy politics. Her route would take her through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, across terrain notorious for unpredictable weather and limited radio communication. The mission required precision navigation through narrow mountain passes where GPS signals were unreliable and visual landmarks could disappear quickly if clouds moved in. Emergency landing sites were scarce, and rescue operations in the mountainous terrain could take hours to organize even under ideal conditions. The assignment represented either recognition of Maya's exceptional abilities or a deliberate attempt to place her in a situation where failure was more likely than success. Brad Mitchell's expression suggested he interpreted it as the latter, his smirk indicating satisfaction that Maya would finally face challenges that might expose her supposed inadequacies. Other cadets exchanged glances that conveyed different interpretations of Peterson's decision, some seeing it as unfair pressure, while others viewed it as appropriate recognition of her demonstrated skills. Maya accepted the assignment without visible reaction, understanding that any protest would be interpreted as weakness or unwillingness to accept challenging missions. Her years of experience had taught her that competence was often rewarded with increased responsibility rather than recognition, that proving your abilities often led to higher expectations rather than easier assignments. She approached the briefing materials with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to every aspect of her training, studying the route carefully and identifying potential complications that might arise during the flight. The weather briefing revealed conditions that were technically within acceptable parameters but carried warning signs that experienced pilots would recognize as potentially problematic. A low-pressure system was moving through the region, bringing the possibility of mountain obscuration and turbulence that could make navigation challenging even for experienced pilots. The forecast called for clear conditions during the morning hours when most flights would be conducted, But afternoon deterioration was possible as thermal activity increased and cloud formation became more likely. Maya's route would take her deeper into the mountain range than most other cadets, requiring her to navigate through areas where weather could change rapidly and dramatically. The mission planning required careful attention to fuel consumption, alternate landing sites, and emergency procedures that might become necessary if conditions deteriorated beyond safe limits. Her navigation would need to be precise enough to locate specific checkpoints using only visual references and basic radio navigation aids, skills that had been developed through months of training but never tested under potentially hazardous conditions. The pre-flight briefing concluded with standard reminders about safety procedures and communication protocols that all cadets had memorized through repetition. Colonel Peterson's delivery was professional, but carried undertones that suggested he was particularly interested in how certain cadets would perform under pressure. His eyes lingered on Maya longer than necessary when discussing emergency procedures, as if expecting her to require such information more than her classmates. As cadets dispersed to their aircraft for final preparations, the social dynamics that had defined their academy experience continued to influence even these crucial moments. Brad Mitchell's supporters gathered around him for photographs and expressions of confidence that reinforced his status as the class's natural leader. Other cliques formed temporary alliances based on shared nervousness or mutual encouragement, creating networks of support that excluded those who didn't fit established social patterns. Maya found herself isolated during these final moments. Her concentration focused entirely on mission preparation, while around her classmates enjoyed the camaraderie that she had been systematically denied. The isolation was both painful and liberating. Painful because it reminded her of everything she had sacrificed to pursue her dreams. Liberating because it freed her from distractions that might compromise her performance when it mattered most. The hangar gradually emptied as cadets taxied their aircraft to the runway for departure. Each takeoff was monitored by instructors who evaluated everything from radio procedures to aircraft handling, noting details that would influence final grades and recommendations for advanced training. The morning air filled with the sound of aircraft engines as the Academy's training mission got underway, sending dozens of future pilots into Nevada airspace to prove they deserved the wings they hoped to earn. Maya's departure slot came near the end of the sequence, allowing her to observe other cadets' takeoffs and note techniques that might prove useful during her own flight. She watched Brad Mitchell's departure with particular attention, noting his textbook procedures and confident aircraft handling that demonstrated the competence underlying his arrogance. Whatever his personal failings, Brad was genuinely skilled at flying, making him a formidable rival rather than a convenient target for dismissal. The T-6 Texan responded to Maya's touch with the familiarity of an aircraft type she had flown many times during training. The single-engine trainer was forgiving but demanding, capable of excellent performance when handled properly but unforgiving of pilot errors or inattention. Its tandem seating configuration placed the pilot in the front seat with clear visibility in all directions, while its conventional landing gear and tailwheel design required careful attention during ground operations. Maya's taxi to the runway was smooth and professional, her radio communications crisp and precise according to established procedures. The tower controllers who managed Riverside's airspace had worked with thousands of student pilots over the years, developing an ability to assess competence through subtle cues in voice tone and procedural compliance. Maya's communications suggested confidence and preparation that marked her as someone likely to complete her mission successfully and safely. The takeoff roll demonstrated the aircraft handling skills that had impressed instructors throughout her training. Maya's control inputs were smooth and precisely timed, bringing the aircraft off the runway at exactly the correct airspeed and establishing a climb that maintained optimal performance without stressing the engine or airframe. Her departure turn was executed with the kind of precision that suggested thousands of hours of experience rather than the limited flight time typical of Academy cadets. As Riverside Flight Academy fell away beneath her wings, Maya felt the familiar sense of peace that came with leaving ground-based complications behind and entering the three-dimensional world where pilot skill was the only currency that mattered. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty a reminder of the unforgiving environment that demanded respect from anyone who dared to challenge it from above. The morning air was smooth and clear, offering visibility that extended to distant mountain ranges where her navigation exercise would unfold. The first checkpoint came into view exactly where her calculations had predicted, confirming that her navigation was accurate and her timing was precise. Maya noted the landmark in her logbook and adjusted her heading for the next waypoint, maintaining the careful attention to detail that would be essential. as she penetrated deeper into mountainous terrain where mistakes could have serious consequences. The aircraft performed flawlessly, its engine running smoothly and all instruments indicating normal operation. Radio communication with air traffic control became more sporadic as she moved away from major airways and into the remote areas where her exercise would take place. The chatter of other aircraft faded to occasional transmissions from commercial flights crossing the region at higher altitudes, leaving Maya alone with the sound of her engine and the vast silence of empty airspace. This solitude was both exhilarating and sobering, reminding her that she was now entirely responsible for her own safety and the success of her mission. The mountain ranges ahead grew larger and more imposing as she approached the most challenging portion of her route. Peaks that had appeared as distant blue shadows from the academy now revealed themselves as towering masses of rock and snow that created their own weather systems and demanded careful navigation to avoid dangerous terrain. The valleys between them offered passages that could be navigated safely by experienced pilots, but the same terrain that provided scenic beauty also created hazards that could trap unwary aviators who failed to respect its power. Maya's training had prepared her for these challenges through countless hours of study and simulation, but theoretical knowledge was about to be tested against reality in ways that would reveal whether she truly possessed the skills necessary for military aviation. The next phase of her flight would take her through terrain where radio communication was limited, and emergency landing sites were non-existent, requiring her to rely entirely on her own abilities and judgment. Unknown to Maya, her solo mission was about to intersect with circumstances that would test every skill she had developed and every lesson she had learned about courage, competence, and character. The morning's clear weather was already beginning to show signs of the deterioration that meteorologists had predicted, and somewhere in the mountains ahead, a situation was developing that would require precisely the kind of exceptional pilot that Maya had trained to become. The stage was set for a confrontation between preparation and crisis, between individual skill and institutional bias, between one woman's determination to prove herself and a system that had spent months trying to convince her she didn't belong. Maya Chen was about to discover that sometimes the greatest tests come not from planned exercises, but from unexpected challenges that reveal who you truly are when everything depends on your response. The radio crackled to life with an urgency that cut through the steady drone of Maya's T-6 engine like a knife through silk. Any aircraft in the vicinity of Granite Ridge, we have an emergency situation developing. Search and rescue helicopter has gone down during a medical evacuation. 7 souls on board, including a critically injured hiker. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Repeat. Any qualified aircraft in the area, please respond immediately. Maya's hands tightened on the controls as she processed the transmission. Granite Ridge lay directly along her planned route, less than 15 miles ahead, through a narrow mountain pass that was already showing signs of the weather deterioration the forecasters had predicted. Clouds were building against the eastern slopes, creating the kind of turbulence that could turn a routine flight into a life-or-death struggle in minutes. The sensible response would be to acknowledge the emergency and continue her training mission while leaving the rescue to professional emergency crews with appropriate equipment and training. But Maya Chen had not spent her life being sensible. She had grown up flying ancient crop dusters through conditions that would ground commercial pilots navigating by instinct and experience through dust storms that turned day into night. She had learned to land on improvised strips that existed only as clearings and cornfields, to calculate fuel consumption down to the last gallon when flying to remote locations with no backup options. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes being qualified meant stepping forward when others stepped back. The transmission repeated with increasing desperation as air traffic controllers attempted to coordinate a response to the crisis. Professional search and rescue teams were mobilizing, but their helicopters were grounded by the deteriorating weather conditions that had already claimed one aircraft. Fixed-wing aircraft from nearby military bases were being scrambled, but their response time would be measured in hours rather than minutes. The injured hiker needed immediate medical attention that could mean the difference between survival and death. Maya keyed her radio microphone with a decision that would define not only her own future, but the way Riverside Flight Academy approached training for generations to come. Control. This is Training 6-7, currently 15 miles south of Granite Ridge on a navigation exercise. I am qualified for search and rescue operations and request permission to divert to assist with the emergency situation. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to stretch for eternity. Maya could imagine the confusion in the control tower as operators tried to process the reality that a student pilot was volunteering for a mission that had already proven too dangerous for experienced professionals. Academy regulations were clear about student pilots avoiding hazardous situations, and the liability issues alone would normally prevent approval of such a request. But emergencies created their own rules, and sometimes those rules favored courage over caution. Training 6-7. Be advised, this is an extremely hazardous situation with deteriorating weather and difficult terrain. Are you certain of your qualifications and willingness to accept these risks? The controller's voice carried the weight of someone who understood that approving this mission could end either in heroism or tragedy, with no middle ground between those extremes. Maya's response came without hesitation. Control. I have extensive experience in mountain flying and emergency operations. I am qualified and willing to attempt the mission. She didn't mention that her qualifications came from crop dusting rather than military training, or that her mountain flying experience had been earned in civilian aircraft over different terrain. What mattered was her absolute confidence that she could navigate the challenges ahead and locate the downed aircraft before weather conditions made rescue impossible. The approval came with warnings and conditions that reflected the gravity of the situation. Maya would be operating under emergency authority that superseded normal training restrictions. But she would also be entirely responsible for her own safety and decision-making. No instructor would be available to provide guidance, no backup support could be guaranteed if she encountered problems, and the weather conditions were expected to continue deteriorating throughout the afternoon. Maya acknowledged the warnings and immediately began calculating the course changes necessary to reach Granite Ridge efficiently, while avoiding the worst of the building weather systems. Her navigation skills, honed through years of practical experience, allowed her to identify alternate routes that would take advantage of terrain features while minimizing exposure to dangerous conditions. The T-6's performance characteristics were perfectly suited for the kind of low-altitude, precise flying that would be required to locate survivors in difficult terrain. The mountain pass ahead revealed itself as a corridor between towering peaks that were already shrouded in the low clouds that marked the leading edge of the approaching weather system. Turbulence began to buffet the aircraft as thermal currents rising from sun-heated valley floors met the cooler air of the incoming storm, creating the kind of unstable conditions that could overwhelm pilots who lacked experience in mountain flying. Maya's controls became more active as she compensated for the irregular air movements, her inputs smooth and precise despite the challenging conditions. The terrain below changed from the relatively gentle desert landscapes of her training route to the harsh rocky slopes and narrow valleys that characterized the high country where the rescue helicopter had gone down. Emergency landing sites were non-existent in this environment, where a forced landing would almost certainly result in aircraft destruction and serious injury or death for anyone on board. The margin for error had disappeared entirely, replaced by conditions that demanded absolute precision and perfect judgment from any pilot attempting to operate in the area. Maya's radio monitoring revealed the coordination efforts taking place as multiple agencies attempted to organize a rescue response. The original helicopter crew had been performing a medical evacuation of a hiker who had suffered serious injuries during a climbing accident. Weather conditions had been marginal but acceptable when they launched, but had deteriorated faster than forecast as the morning progressed. The helicopter had apparently encountered severe turbulence or downdrafts while attempting to extract the patient from a narrow valley, resulting in a crash that now left 8 people in immediate danger instead of 1. The crash site's approximate location had been determined through emergency beacon transmissions and the last known position reported by the helicopter crew before radio contact was lost. However, the terrain was so rugged and the weather conditions so poor that visual location of the wreckage would require flying at extremely low altitudes through valleys where turbulence and limited maneuvering room created significant hazards for any rescue aircraft. Maya began her search pattern using techniques learned during countless hours of crop dusting, where locating specific targets in difficult conditions was a daily requirement. Her systematic approach divided the search area into manageable segments that could be covered efficiently, while minimizing exposure to the most dangerous terrain. The T-6's excellent visibility and responsive handling characteristics made it well suited for the kind of precise flying required to navigate the narrow valleys where the helicopter might have gone down. The weather continued to deteriorate as Maya penetrated deeper into the mountain range. Clouds that had been isolated patches when she began her diversion were now building into solid overcast that reduced visibility and created the potential for spatial disorientation. Turbulence increased in intensity as wind patterns became more complex, forcing Maya to make constant control adjustments to maintain stable flight through the increasingly unstable air mass. Her first pass through the suspected crash area revealed nothing but rocky slopes and dense forest that could easily conceal wreckage from anything but the closest inspection. Maya realized that effective searching would require her to fly much lower than safety normally recommended, bringing her aircraft into the terrain where recovery would be impossible if she encountered problems. The decision to continue required accepting levels of risk that no training manual would endorse, but the alternative was abandoning people who needed immediate help. The second search pass brought Maya down to within a few hundred feet of the valley floor, her aircraft dancing through turbulence that threatened to slam her into the surrounding mountainsides with every gust. Her flying skills, developed through years of practical experience in challenging conditions, enabled her to maintain control while other pilots might have lost spatial reference or structural integrity. The T-6 groaned under the stress of constant maneuvering, but responded to her inputs with the reliability that had made it a successful training aircraft for decades. A glint of reflected sunlight caught Maya's attention during her third pass through a particularly narrow valley, where steep walls limited maneuvering options to an absolute minimum. The reflection was brief and might have been natural, but something about its characteristics suggested metal rather than rock or water. Maya banked sharply to investigate, her aircraft coming dangerously close to the valley walls as she maneuvered for a better view of the potential target. The wreckage revealed itself gradually as Maya descended even lower. Pieces of the helicopter scattered across a small clearing that had been created by the impact. The aircraft had apparently struck trees during its descent, breaking apart as it crashed through the forest canopy before coming to rest in the only open space for miles in any direction. Smoke was still rising from the wreckage, indicating that fires might be burning, and that time was running out for anyone who had survived the initial impact. Maya could see movement near the wreckage as she circled the crash site, confirming that at least some of the helicopter's occupants had survived and were attempting to signal for help. However, the clearing was too small and too rough for any conventional landing, and the surrounding terrain offered no better alternatives for getting rescue personnel to the scene. The helicopter crew and their patient were trapped in a location that could only be reached by aircraft capable of precision operations in extremely confined spaces. The realization that she might be the only pilot capable of executing a rescue in these conditions settled over Maya with a weight that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Her crop dusting experience had taught her to land in impossibly small spaces under challenging conditions, but those landings had been performed with aircraft specifically designed for such operations. The T-6 Texan was a military trainer built for durability rather than short-field performance, and attempting a landing in the tiny clearing would require skills and judgment that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Maya's radio call to the control center described the situation in terms that conveyed both the urgency of the circumstances and the extreme difficulty of any rescue attempt. The survivors were confirmed to be alive but potentially seriously injured. The clearing was barely large enough for a landing attempt, and weather conditions were continuing to worsen as afternoon thermal activity increased. Professional rescue crews would be unable to reach the site for hours even under ideal conditions, and the deteriorating weather was making helicopter operations increasingly hazardous. The response from the control center reflected the gravity of the decision Maya was contemplating. She was being asked to attempt a landing that experienced test pilots would consider extremely dangerous in an aircraft not designed for such operations, at a location where recovery would be impossible if anything went wrong. The risks were enormous, the margin for error was non-existent, and failure would almost certainly result in additional casualties rather than successful rescue. But Maya had not come this far to be deterred by risk assessments or safety considerations that assumed normal circumstances. The people in the clearing below were counting on someone having the skill and courage to attempt what others considered impossible. Her father had died serving others in military aviation, and she understood that sometimes service required accepting risks that others wouldn't take. Her decision to attempt the landing was communicated to the control center with the quiet confidence of someone who had calculated the odds and found them acceptable despite their apparent impossibility. Maya began her approach to the tiny clearing with the knowledge that she was about to attempt something that would either establish her as one of the most skilled pilots of her generation or end her flying career permanently in a mountain valley where rescue would come too late to matter. The approach required techniques that no academy textbook had ever described, using the natural contours of the valley to lose altitude while maintaining precise control over airspeed and descent rate. Maya's hands moved over the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to fly by necessity rather than instruction, compensating for wind gusts and turbulence that would have challenged pilots with decades more experience than her official logbook reflected. The T-6 settled toward the clearing with agonizing slowness as Maya bled off excess speed while maintaining enough power to escape if the approach became untenable. Trees flashed past her wingtips with clearances measured in feet rather than safe margins, and the rough terrain ahead promised a landing that would test both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. But Maya Chen had been testing limits her entire life, and she approached this ultimate challenge with the same determination that had carried her from crop dusting to military academy. Despite every obstacle placed in her path, the touchdown came with a jolt that rattled every rivet in the T-6's airframe. But the aircraft held together as Maya fought to control the rollout on terrain that was never intended to serve as a runway. Her brakes and rudder inputs were perfectly timed to bring the aircraft to a stop, just short of the trees that marked the clearing's far boundary, completing a landing that would be analyzed and discussed by aviation experts for decades to come. As Maya shut down the engine and climbed from the cockpit, she had no idea that her rescue mission was being monitored by every air traffic control center in the region, that her radio transmissions were being recorded for analysis, or that her landing had been witnessed by military personnel who would carry the story back to Riverside Flight Academy with details that would transform her from Academy outcast to instant legend. The survivors of the helicopter crash greeted her with the kind of relief and gratitude that made every risk worthwhile. But Maya was already focused on the next challenge, getting everyone safely out of a location that had just barely accepted one aircraft and might not permit another departure under the deteriorating weather conditions that were closing in around them with increasing intensity. The convoy of black SUVs racing across the Nevada desert toward Granite Ridge kicked up clouds of dust that could be seen for miles, their emergency lights painting the afternoon landscape in urgent reds and blues. Inside the lead vehicle, General Patricia Hayes gripped her secure phone with white knuckles as she listened to radio transmissions that described an impossible rescue mission being executed by someone who wasn't supposed to exist. The student pilot who had just landed a T-6 Texan in a mountain clearing barely large enough for a helicopter was performing medical triage and preparing for an extraction that defied every assumption about training limitations and institutional capabilities. General Hayes had built her career on understanding exactly what was possible within the rigid constraints of military aviation, but the reports reaching her command center suggested that someone had just rewritten those constraints without bothering to consult the manual. A first-year cadet from Riverside Flight Academy had responded to an emergency that grounded experienced rescue crews, executed a landing that test pilots would consider suicidal, and was now coordinating medical care for multiple casualties while preparing for a departure that would challenge the laws of physics and aerodynamics. The general's aide, Captain David Thompson, monitored communications traffic while simultaneously coordinating with multiple agencies trying to support the mountain rescue operation. Weather reports indicated that conditions were deteriorating even faster than predicted, with winds increasing to levels that would make helicopter operations impossible and cloud cover dropping to altitudes that would prevent traditional rescue aircraft from operating safely. The window for extracting the survivors was closing rapidly, and everyone understood that failure would mean spending the night on a mountainside where temperatures would drop below freezing. Thompson's expression grew increasingly incredulous as he relayed updates from the crash site. The student pilot had established triage priorities for 8 casualties, improvised medical supplies from aircraft emergency kits, and was somehow managing to treat injuries that ranged from severe trauma to hypothermia. More remarkably, she was preparing to extract multiple passengers in an aircraft designed for single-seat training operations, requiring modifications to seating and weight distribution that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities. General Hayes had initially dismissed the reports as exaggerated accounts of a training exercise gone wrong, but the details streaming in from multiple sources painted a picture of competence that couldn't be explained by standard academy training. The pilot's radio communications demonstrated knowledge of emergency medical procedures that weren't taught in basic flight school, tactical decision-making that reflected experience far beyond what any cadet should possess, and aircraft handling skills that suggested thousands of hours of practical experience rather than the limited flight time typical of academy students. The helicopter wreckage that Maya had discovered contained the crew of a medical evacuation flight that had been attempting to rescue an injured climber when severe weather forced them down. The impact had been severe enough to destroy the aircraft, but survivable for most of its occupants, leaving them stranded in terrain that was inaccessible to ground rescue teams and too dangerous for normal aviation operations. The original patient's condition had been complicated by exposure and additional trauma from the crash, creating multiple medical emergencies that required immediate attention. Maya's assessment of the situation had been swift and professional, demonstrating medical knowledge that surprised the helicopter's flight medic, who had survived the crash with minor injuries. Her triage decisions reflected training that went far beyond basic first aid, and her improvisation of medical supplies showed resourcefulness that came from experience rather than textbook knowledge. The injured were stabilized as much as possible given the limited resources available, but their survival ultimately depended on successful extraction before nightfall brought temperatures that would prove fatal to those already weakened by trauma and exposure. The T-6 Texan had never been designed for medical evacuation operations, but Maya's modifications demonstrated understanding of aircraft systems and weight distribution that enabled her to convert the training aircraft into an improvised ambulance. The rear seat was reconfigured to accommodate a stretcher case, additional passengers were positioned to maintain proper center of gravity, and non-essential equipment was removed to compensate for the increased payload that would challenge the aircraft's performance limitations. Meanwhile, back at Riverside Flight Academy, word of the rescue mission was spreading through unofficial channels that carried news faster than any official communication system. Maintenance crews monitoring radio traffic had overheard fragments of the emergency response and began piecing together a story that seemed too extraordinary to be true. A cadet who had been systematically dismissed and marginalized was apparently executing a rescue mission that professional crews couldn't attempt, using skills that nobody knew she possessed. Brad Mitchell's reaction to the news reflected the cognitive dissonance of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by incoming evidence. His initial response was disbelief. Maya Chen couldn't possibly be performing the kind of advanced aviation that he heard described in the radio transmissions. Student pilots didn't land aircraft in mountain clearings, didn't perform medical triage, and certainly didn't execute rescue missions that challenged experienced professionals. The reports had to be exaggerated or misunderstood by people who didn't understand aviation well enough to accurately assess what they were witnessing. But as more details emerged from multiple independent sources, Brad's disbelief transformed into something approaching panic. His entire identity was built on the assumption that privilege and connections produced superior pilots, that his family background and social status reflected genuine capabilities that justified his position at the top of the Academy's hierarchy. If Maya Chen could demonstrate skills that surpassed his own despite lacking his advantages, then everything he believed about merit and natural superiority was called into question. Colonel Peterson's response was more complex, reflecting the institutional biases that had shaped his career and the growing realization that those biases had blinded him to exceptional capability. His dismissive treatment of Maya had been based on assumptions about gender and background that prevented him from recognizing the signs of advanced competence that were apparent to anyone willing to look objectively. The rescue mission wasn't just challenging his assessment of one particular cadet, it was forcing him to confront the systematic failures that had characterized his approach to instruction and evaluation. Lisa Park found herself caught between amazement and guilt as she listened to radio reports that described her roommate's extraordinary performance. She had always known that Maya possessed unusual competence, but even she hadn't suspected the depth of knowledge and skill that was now being demonstrated under the most challenging possible conditions. Lisa's guilt stemmed from the realization that she had allowed social pressures to prevent her from fully supporting someone whose capabilities far exceeded those of the privileged cadets she had been trying to impress. The extraction process began with Maya calculating takeoff performance requirements that pushed the T-6 beyond its normal operational envelope. The short, rough clearing that had barely accommodated her landing would demand perfect technique to achieve a departure angle steep enough to clear the surrounding trees while carrying a payload that compromised the aircraft's climb performance. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate, with increasing winds and lowering visibility that made the timing critical for any successful escape from the mountain valley. General Hayes arrived at the temporary command post that had been established near the base of the mountain range, where radio communications equipment allowed monitoring of the rescue operation while coordination efforts continued with multiple agencies. The scene resembled a military operation more than a training exercise, with personnel from various services working together to support a mission that had evolved far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The general's first direct communication with Maya came as the young pilot was conducting her pre-flight checks before attempting the most dangerous phase of the rescue operation. Maya's voice over the radio was calm and professional, providing status updates and requesting weather information with the composure of someone who had faced life-or-death situations many times before. Her technical questions demonstrated knowledge of aircraft performance and weather phenomena that reflected extensive experience in challenging flying conditions. General Hayes found herself asking questions that revealed her growing suspicion that Maya Chen was not quite what she appeared to be. The pilot's knowledge of high-altitude flying techniques, her familiarity with mountain weather patterns, and her confidence in executing complex emergency procedures all suggested background that extended far beyond standard academy training. The general began to wonder if the academy's admissions process had somehow overlooked a candidate with significant prior experience. The takeoff attempt would require Maya to execute a short-field departure that combined maximum performance techniques with precise timing to clear obstacles while carrying passengers who added weight and complexity to aircraft handling. The T-6's engine would be operating at maximum power settings that stressed its mechanical limits, while the pilot would need to balance climb rate against airspeed to achieve the steepest possible departure angle without stalling the aircraft into the surrounding terrain. Maya's radio calls during the takeoff sequence demonstrated the kind of precision and confidence that marked exceptional pilots operating under extreme pressure. Her technique was flawless, combining textbook procedures with improvised modifications that reflected deep understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft behavior. The T-6 lifted off from the tiny clearing, with clearances measured in feet, climbing at angles that seemed to defy the laws of physics while maintaining the precise control necessary to avoid disaster. The radio transmissions that followed Maya's successful departure from the mountain clearing reached General Hayes with a clarity that cut through the static and interference that had characterized earlier communications. Maya was requesting medical assistance for her passengers and guidance for the fastest route to appropriate hospital facilities, her voice steady despite having just completed one of the most challenging rescue operations in military aviation history. But it was Maya's next transmission that stopped General Hayes cold and began the process that would transform understanding of who Maya Chen really was. In requesting landing clearance at the nearest military medical facility, Maya had identified herself using call signs and procedures that were current but not taught in civilian flight training or basic military programs. Her phraseology and technical references suggested familiarity with operational procedures that cadets shouldn't know, and her confident handling of complex airspace coordination spoke to experience that extended far beyond anything in her official academy records. General Hayes made the decision to personally debrief Maya immediately upon her landing, sensing that there were layers to this story that hadn't yet been revealed. The rescue mission had demonstrated capabilities that demanded explanation, but more importantly, it had raised questions about institutional assumptions and evaluation processes that had apparently failed to recognize exceptional ability when it appeared in unexpected forms. The landing at Nellis Air Force Base brought Maya's T-6 to a stop on runways designed for supersonic fighters and strategic bombers, where medical teams were waiting to receive casualties whose survival had depended entirely on one pilot's willingness to attempt what others considered impossible. As Maya shut down her engine and opened the canopy, she had no idea that her actions over the past 4 hours had set in motion a series of investigations and revelations that would reshape not only her own future, but the way military aviation approached questions of capability and character. The medical teams that received the rescued passengers confirmed that Maya's triage and treatment decisions had been not only appropriate, but probably life-saving for several casualties who wouldn't have survived much longer in the mountain conditions. Her improvised medical care had demonstrated knowledge that typically required extensive training, while her aircraft modifications had shown engineering insight that reflected deep understanding of systems and performance characteristics. General Hayes approached the T-6 as Maya completed her post-flight procedures, noting details about the young pilot's demeanor and competence that suggested this conversation would be unlike any debriefing she had ever conducted. Maya's bearing was professional but relaxed, showing the kind of confidence that came from knowing she had performed exactly as circumstances required. There was no trace of the nervousness or excitement that would be expected from a cadet who had just completed her first emergency mission. The general's opening question was deceptively simple but designed to probe the foundations of what everyone thought they knew about Maya Chen. Cadet, that was exceptional, flying under impossible conditions. Where exactly did you learn to handle aircraft like that? Maya's response would begin a process of revelation that would expose not only her true background, but the systematic failures that had prevented the Academy from recognizing who she really was. Her answer would force everyone involved to confront their assumptions about capability and worth, about the relationship between privilege and competence, and about the cost of institutional biases that dismissed excellence when it appeared in unexpected forms. The young woman standing beside the T-6 Texan was about to reveal herself as someone whose story would challenge everything Riverside Flight Academy thought it knew about identifying and developing exceptional pilots. The rescue mission had been only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape military aviation's understanding of where real capability could be found, and how it should be recognized when it emerged from the shadows where prejudice and assumption had tried to keep it hidden. Maya's answer came with the quiet dignity of someone who had carried a secret too long and finally found the right moment to release it. General, my name isn't Maya Chen, it's Maya Restrepo, and before I came to the Academy, I flew combat missions in Afghanistan as Captain Maya Restrepo, 455th Air Expeditionary Wing. The words fell into the desert's silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the tarmac where they stood. General Hayes felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of everything that had transpired over the past months. The exceptional pilot standing before her wasn't a gifted cadet who had risen to extraordinary circumstances. She was a decorated combat veteran who had been systematically diminished and dismissed by an institution that failed to recognize who she truly was. The rescue mission that had seemed miraculous suddenly became explicable, the product of skills earned through years of flying dangerous missions in one of the world's most challenging combat environments. The story that unfolded in the debriefing room at Nellis Air Force Base revealed layers of institutional failure and personal resilience that challenged every assumption about military justice and recognition of merit. Maya had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, flying close air support missions that had saved countless lives and earned her decorations for valor that few pilots would ever receive. Her service record included successful missions under conditions that tested the limits of both pilot and aircraft, establishing her reputation as one of the most capable combat pilots of her generation. But Maya's military career had ended abruptly when she reported systematic maintenance irregularities that were compromising aircraft safety and endangering aircrews. The corruption she exposed involved senior officers who had been falsifying maintenance records and cutting corners on safety procedures to improve their performance metrics and advance their careers. Her whistleblowing had ultimately prevented multiple aircraft disasters but had also made her powerful enemies who were determined to destroy her credibility and end her military service. The retaliation had been swift and devastating. False allegations about her mental health and judgment had been manufactured by the same officers whose corruption she had exposed. Her combat decorations were questioned, her mission reports were subjected to hostile review, and her character was systematically assassinated by people who valued their own advancement over the safety of the aircrews under their command. Within 6 months, Captain Maya Restrepo had been medically discharged from the Air Force with conditions that barred her from future military service. The discharge had stripped away not only her career but her identity, leaving her with civilian pilot credentials that couldn't adequately express her capabilities and experience that couldn't be officially recognized. She had legally changed her name to escape the shadow of the false allegations that followed her discharge, creating a new identity that allowed her to pursue her dream of military aviation through the only path remaining, starting over as a cadet at the bottom of the system that had betrayed her. General Hayes listened to Maya's account with growing horror and admiration, recognizing the extraordinary courage required not only to expose corruption, but to rebuild a shattered life through sheer determination. The young woman who had been dismissed as a diversity admission and mocked for her humble background was actually one of the most accomplished pilots in military aviation, someone whose combat experience far exceeded that of her instructors, and whose technical knowledge had been earned through years of operational flying. The general's investigation into Maya's claims revealed documentation that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and official denial. Her combat records, when finally located and declassified, painted a picture of exceptional service under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Mission reports detailed successful operations that had prevented enemy attacks and saved American lives, while her evaluations from field commanders consistently rated her performance as outstanding. The corruption that Maya had exposed was gradually being uncovered by investigators who were finally able to pursue leads that had been suppressed during the initial retaliation against her. Multiple aircraft accidents that had previously been attributed to pilot error were being re-examined in light of evidence that maintenance procedures had been compromised. The officers who had orchestrated her downfall were facing criminal charges that would end their careers and potentially result in prison sentences. But Maya's response to this vindication surprised everyone who expected her to demand immediate restoration of her rank and recognition of her service. When General Hayes offered to reinstate her commission with promotion and assignment to any squadron she chose, Maya requested time to consider her options. The years of exile had taught her valuable lessons about the difference between external validation and internal worth, between institutional recognition and personal fulfillment. The revelation of Maya's true identity sent shockwaves through Riverside Flight Academy that reached every level of the institution's hierarchy. Colonel Peterson found himself facing career-ending investigations into his discriminatory practices and failure to recognize exceptional capability when it appeared in unexpected forms. His systematic dismissal of Maya's abilities was revealed as the product of biases that had prevented him from seeing what should have been obvious to any competent evaluator. Brad Mitchell's world collapsed with a completeness that left him struggling to understand how everything he had believed about merit and superiority could be so fundamentally wrong. The woman he had mocked and dismissed was not only more capable than him, but had achieved more in military aviation than he could hope to accomplish in an entire career. His privilege and connections, which had seemed so important at the academy, were revealed as hollow advantages that meant nothing when measured against genuine competence and character. The social hierarchy that had defined academy life disintegrated as cadets were forced to confront the reality that their assumptions about worth and capability had been completely inverted. The outsider they had excluded and diminished was actually the most accomplished pilot among them, while those who had claimed natural superiority based on family connections had demonstrated nothing more than inherited prejudice and institutional bias. Maya's decision about her future came after a week of reflection that took her back to the Nevada desert, where she had learned to find peace in solitude and purpose in service. She had spent years dreaming of vindication and restoration, but the reality of those achievements felt less important than the lessons she had learned about resilience and the true meaning of success. Her response, when it came, would surprise everyone who expected her to claim the recognition she deserved. The press conference that General Hayes convened to announce the resolution of Maya's case was attended by military officials, aviation journalists, and academy personnel, who gathered to witness what they expected to be a moment of triumph and restoration. Maya appeared in civilian clothes rather than military uniform, her demeanor calm and confident, as she prepared to address questions about her extraordinary journey from combat pilot to academy cadet to national hero. Her statement was brief and focused on the future rather than the past. Maya announced that while she appreciated the Air Force's offer to reinstate her commission, she had chosen a different path that would allow her to serve aviation and military personnel in ways that transcended traditional institutional boundaries. She would be establishing the Restrepo Foundation, dedicated to supporting military personnel who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct and helping them rebuild their careers and lives. Additionally, Maya revealed her plans to create an aviation training program specifically designed for pilots from non-traditional backgrounds, providing opportunities for those who possessed exceptional ability but lacked the connections and advantages that traditionally opened doors in military aviation. Her own experience had taught her that capability could be found in unexpected places, and she was determined to ensure that future generations of pilots would be evaluated solely on their merit rather than their background or social connections. The Foundation would also investigate cases of military injustice and provide legal support for personnel who faced retaliation for doing the right thing. Maya understood that her own case was not unique, that the military system contained structural problems that destroyed good people who threatened corrupt practices or challenged institutional biases. Her goal was to create accountability and protection for those who served with honor but lacked the power to defend themselves against systemic abuse. The final surprise in Maya's announcement was her acceptance of a position as civilian flight instructor at a reformed Riverside Flight Academy, where she would help train the next generation of military pilots using methods that emphasized character and competence over connections and conformity. Her role would include developing new evaluation procedures that identified genuine capability regardless of its source, and creating mentorship programs that supported all cadets rather than favoring those from privileged backgrounds. The Academy's transformation under new leadership reflected the broader changes that Maya's case had catalyzed throughout military aviation. Colonel Peterson was replaced by leaders who understood that excellence could emerge from any background, and that institutional success depended on recognizing and developing talent wherever it appeared. New policies ensured that evaluation procedures focused on performance rather than pedigree, while support systems were established to protect cadets from discrimination and harassment. Brad Mitchell's departure from the Academy marked the end of an era when family connections could substitute for personal character. His commission was revoked after investigations revealed patterns of discriminatory behavior that violated military standards of conduct. The young man who had believed himself destined for military leadership found himself facing civilian life with no clear direction and a reputation that would follow him far beyond his academy years. Lisa Park emerged as one of the Academy's most effective advocates for reform, using her family connections to support changes that would prevent future instances of systemic discrimination. Her friendship with Maya had taught her valuable lessons about courage and loyalty that shaped her approach to military service and leadership development. She became a mentor for cadets from diverse backgrounds, helping them navigate institutional challenges while maintaining their integrity and pursuing their dreams. The aviation training program that Maya established grew rapidly as word spread throughout the military community about opportunities for pilots who had been overlooked or marginalized by traditional systems. Veterans who had been forced out of service for reporting misconduct found new paths to contribute their skills and experience. Young pilots from rural backgrounds discovered that their practical experience was valued and developed rather than dismissed as irrelevant to military requirements. Maya's own flying continued through her civilian instructor role, but she also found fulfillment in watching others discover their potential and achieve dreams that had once seemed impossible. Her office at the Reformed Academy was decorated not with personal awards and recognition, but with photographs of students who had overcome obstacles and succeeded through determination and hard work. Each graduation represented validation of her belief that aviation excellence could emerge from any background when given proper opportunities and support. The rescue mission that had revealed Maya's true identity became a case study in aviation training programs throughout the military, but not for the reasons most people expected. Rather than focusing on the technical aspects of the emergency landing and extraction, instructors used Maya's story to teach lessons about character, perseverance, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize genuine capability. Years later, Maya would reflect on the journey that had taken her from combat pilot to academy outcast to respected educator and advocate. The pain of betrayal and injustice had been real, but it had also taught her valuable lessons about resilience and the true sources of satisfaction in life. She had learned that external recognition, while gratifying, was less important than the knowledge that she had served others and helped create opportunities for future generations of pilots. The desert sunset painted the Nevada sky in brilliant colors as Maya completed another day of flight instruction, watching her students taxi their aircraft back to the hangar after successful training flights. Some were from military families with generations of service, others from backgrounds as humble as her own. What united them was their shared commitment to excellence in service, their willingness to work hard and support each other, regardless of their origins or social connections. Maya smiled as she watched Tommy Rodriguez, now an accomplished instructor himself, debrief a nervous student who had just completed her first solo flight. The young woman's tears of joy and relief reflected the same emotions Maya had felt during her own first solo years earlier, before combat missions and institutional betrayal had complicated her relationship with flying. In helping others discover their potential, Maya had rediscovered the pure joy of aviation that had first drawn her to military service. The foundation that bore her name continued to grow, supporting hundreds of military personnel who faced retaliation for ethical actions and helping them rebuild their careers and lives. Each success story represented validation of Maya's belief that justice delayed was not justice denied, that persistence and integrity could ultimately triumph over corruption and prejudice. As darkness fell over the academy, Maya looked up at the stars that had guided generations of pilots and felt deep satisfaction with the path she had chosen. She had proven that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming systems, not from claiming recognition, but from creating opportunities for others. The girl who had dreamed of following in her father's footsteps had become something greater, a leader who opened pathways for others to follow their own dreams of service and achievement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.